The Triple Crown is probably the greatest prize in all of horse racing. In 5 weeks, you can go from just owning a regular racehorse to a legend who is effectively immortal. Imagine owning such an incredible steed. Must be incredible to say, that animal is yours. But there's gotta be something truly special about riding it, getting on this four-legged superstar's back and guiding its talent towards the greatest goal, the Triple Crown. That was the dream that 20-year-old Willie Saunders was living in 1935. But in the same year he won the Triple Crown and was on top of the horse racing world, he would be accused of one of the worst crimes known to man: murder in a supposed drunken hit and run. The jockey who guided a four-legged vessel to glory would be accused of taking a back seat to a different kind of vehicle as it proceeded to end a woman's life. The year is 1935, the middle of the Great Depression, and the Triple Crown wasn't as concrete as it is today. The term Triple Crown, in reference to the Kentucky Derby, the Preakness, and the Belmont, dates all the way back to 1923, coined by Charles Hatton, when only Sir Barton had won all three. But the New York Times would start using the term more seriously 7 years later in 1930, when Gallant Fox was en route to winning the Belmont Stakes. But no other papers used it at the time. While the Triple Crown would have to wait till War Admiral's victory in 1937 to be universally accepted, in 1935 it was commonly used, but there still were a few detractors. When Gallant Fox had retired after an almost spotless 3-year-old season, he was sent immediately to stud. His two big successes came from 2 matings with the same broodmare, Flambino. The first of these foals was a horse named Omaha, who would follow in his father's footsteps and win the Triple Crown. But it took some time for Omaha to become Triple Crown material. At the age of 2, he would only win a single time in 9 starts, with his last race that year being a second in the Junior Championship at the end of September. In those 9 starts, he would have 2 of the top jockeys at the time riding him: James Stout, who would later win the Kentucky Derby and the Belmont Stakes with Johnstown in 1939, and Charlie Kurtzinger, who would ride War Admiral to victory in the 1937 Triple Crown, and to defeat in the famous match race against Seabiscuit in 1938. But neither seemed to be able to get the best out of Omaha, so when Omaha was given a break at the end of 1934, Omaha was going to get a few changes. He would grow and mature over those 6 months, and he would be given a new rider, a young up-and-coming jockey named Willie "Smoky" Saunders. And the two seemed to be a good fit, with Saunders helping work out some of Omaha's less desirable quirks, such as his habit of biting horses during races and workouts when they got too close to him. Saunders would make sure to guide Omaha to the outside so that he was never too close to any other horses. He would use this strategy to give Omaha his first victory as a 3-year-old in his very first start. He followed that up 5 days later with a third in the Wood Memorial. Those 2 starts to kick off his 3-year-old season were enough for Omaha to temporarily be the favorite for the Kentucky Derby, but eventually, the status of favorite would be given to a filly named Nellie Flagg, ridden by a Kentucky Derby newcomer named Eddie R. Caro. It was his first Derby, and definitely not his last, but his first win in the Kentucky Derby would have to wait a few years. For now, it would be Omaha's day, as he would be guided by the young 20-year-old Saunders, stalking in the backstretch before making a bold sweeping run. By the far turn, he led the pack and held off Roman Soldier to win the Kentucky Derby. He then pulled the same tactic in the Preakness Stakes, letting a long shot do the dirty work at the start and taking the lead. But in the backstretch, Omaha would sweep by them again, and this time win even more emphatically, winning by 6 lengths instead of just the simple 1 length in the Derby. In between the Preakness and the Belmont Stakes, he would lose the Wither Stakes to a horse named Rosemont, who would later become famous for defeating Seabiscuit in the 1937 Santa Anita Handicap by just a nose. He'd get his rematch in the Belmont Stakes. Rosemont would not run his race that day, with his biggest challenge instead coming in the form of Firethorn, who had previously finished second to Omaha in the Preakness Stakes and was destined to meet the same fate in the Belmont Stakes, although he would not go down without a fight, locking heads with the Triple Crown hopeful down the stretch, but losing in the final strides when Omaha suddenly opened up a length and a half, securing his Triple Crown. And with that, Omaha was now the only son of a Triple Crown winner to win the Triple Crown, and Willie Saunders was now the youngest jockey to win the Triple Crown at just 20 years old, although he would be dethroned decades later by the 18-year-old Steve Cawthon, unaffirmed. But all of that would come later. Right now, Saunders was on top of the racing world, a Triple Crown winning jockey. But it would be the last time that Willie Saunders ever rode Omaha. Omaha would continue his 3-year-old season under jockey Wayne Wright, and then retire at the age of 4 after a unique campaign in Europe under jockey Pat Beasley, highlighted by an excruciating loss in the 1936 Ascot Gold Cup to a filly named Quashed. Interestingly, Omaha had a younger full brother named Flares, who in 1938 would avenge his brother's defeat and win the Ascot Gold Cup outright, but Saunders' life would take a different direction. It was now October of 1935, barely 4 months since Saunders had won the Triple Crown. On this day, Saunders and exercise rider Walter Schaefer would go down to a nightclub simply called Howard's in Lexington, Kentucky. The bar would require any male customers to have a female escort. Their escorts that night would be Agnes Mackinson and Evelyn Sliwinski. Saunders and Schaefer would introduce themselves under pseudonyms. Saunders was now Jimmy, and Schaefer was now Tommy. We'll just continue calling them Schaefer and Saunders for simplicity. Schaefer and Evelyn were both 25 years old, a good 5 years older than Saunders, and Agnes was 28, a whole 8 years older. This will become important later on. Where things get a bit tough is that there are 2 different first-hand accounts by the people involved. And to make matters even more difficult, both parties were also drunk when the event took place. But what is universally agreed upon is all 4 of them left the bar inebriated and went into Saunders' car with Schaefer driving. Already not a good sign. Mackinson took shotgun, and Saunders and Sliwinski would be in the back, arguing as Schaefer drove them around. Eventually, Sliwinski would throw up in the car and was finally let out, on a small, dark road. She would stagger out of the car, onto the road, left in near darkness, as the rest of them would drive off. But after just a few miles, they would turn back towards Louisville. They were speeding down the road at over 50 miles an hour, until suddenly, there was a bump. They had hit something. They didn't dare find out, and kept going forward, passing by a car with a certain pair of headlights that Schaefer would recognize later on. They would then drop off Mackinson at her home, and the next day, Sliwinski's body was found dead and mangled by a high schooler named Philip Ticky Schultz. Despite using fake names, Schaefer and Saunders would be identified and arrested only a few days later. Saunders would be arrested for accessory to murder for being in the backseat of the car, and Schaefer for the murder as he was the one driving it. The trial would begin 2 months later in January of 1936, and this is where things start to get really cloudy. The details of the stories vary greatly depending on the 3 stories given that night. There's Saunders/Schaefer's story, the one that turned out to be the most believed by the court, Mackinson's, and a third surprise story by a grocery clerk named Raymond Marilla. Let's start with the first story, Saunders and Schaefer's. They simply said they didn't see what they hit, believing it was either a rock or a cat, although Saunders later did say, quote, he had an idea they might have hit the girl. Story number 2, Mackinson's. Mackinson purported that Saunders was a bit more than just a backseat passenger through it all, saying that Saunders had struck Sliwinski in the jaw on their way out of the bar. And as they were riding in the car, Sliwinski would temporarily fall unconscious. What was told next was absolutely vile. Mackinson would go into detail on how Saunders had taken advantage of her unconscious body, telling Mackinson to just look ahead. After the bump, she described the 2 as more paranoid and aggressive than they had let on. While they may have started out with telling Mackinson that they probably just hit a cat or a rock, after inspecting the car, Saunders told Schaefer to step on it. I think the law is after us. And after dropping off Mackinson, they told her, you ain't seen nothing, you ain't heard nothing, you don't know nothing, and you're lucky you're alive. 2 very polarizing first accounts, and then came the curveball, a third account by Raymond Marilla. Right after the bump, Schaefer had described seeing the headlights of a car. Raymond said those headlights likely belonged to the person who first found the body, Philip Schultz, saying he saw Philip's car lights over Evelyn's body. Raymond then recounted the brief exchange he had. Philip said he had hit the woman. Raymond told him to keep quiet because someone could hear them, but Philip would go on to deny the story had ever happened, ultimately leading to a dead end. With a lack of evidence and mostly just contradicting anecdotes, the court would give an anticlimactic conclusion. Quote, there was no murder, no involuntary manslaughter. Here were 2 women seeking to pick up 2 men. These ladies of the evening were experienced. These boys were not. Turns out, being the youngest Triple Crown jockey at the time was a saving grace for Saunders, being found not guilty of all charges, And not even just that. Saunders and Schaefer got away with a surprising amount during the whole ordeal. While being held in custody, Saunders joked with the cops about having a drink when he was released, and Schaefer was allowed to be driven back to Louisville from Baltimore for the trial unshackled, just because he said he wouldn't try anything. That drive was 21 hours long. Saunders and Schaefer were given about as much sympathy as a murder suspect can possibly get, and the consequences for their drunken night were practically non-existent. Saunders returned to the saddle immediately, riding and winning races until 1950, as well as serving in World War II and making a cameo in a motion picture. Even with such an open secret, Willie Saunders was able to get out of this mess practically scot-free. Was it the right choice? Was he truly just in the wrong place at the wrong time? Or did Mackinson know something that no one else dared to believe? Or did the killer report his own victim and get away with it? That is for you to decide.